Hey, church family. Gosh, I miss you guys, and it's just a great opportunity for me tonight to kind of speak to you and share with you some thoughts on the book of Proverbs. And as we approach this study, I was thinking about, how we spend time in the Word together regularly. And much of our study in the Bible centers around what it means to have a faithful and an intimate relationship with the Lord, and how our God loves us so much, he was willing to have his son die so we can have eternal life with him, despite our flaws and our missteps and our failures. And so we wanted to begin tonight this study on Proverbs. We're going to go through a series of 6 or 7 weeks where various leaders will come together and talk about their different parts of the book as we go through it together. And so tonight I'm just going to kick it off, and I'm going to go through Proverbs 1 through 5, and I'd like to just share with you a few of the highlights that I see in these chapters as we approach this. I think as we all think about the book of Proverbs, the message could be summed up in one word, and that is wisdom. But I think we ought to challenge ourselves to think about what that means and why that's important to us, why that's something we should value, why that's something we should pursue. Eugene Peterson, an author, sums up the message of Proverbs really well, or points out that the phrase Jesus taught us to pray, on earth as it is in heaven, requires wisdom. About how we live our life, in the conditions that we find ourselves in daily, how we live our life as Christians throughout our life here on earth. And he points out that wisdom has to do with becoming skillful in honoring our parents and how we raise our children, handling of our money, conducting our sexual lives, going to work, and exercising leadership, using words well, and treating others kindly, for eating and drinking healthily, and yet also cultivating emotions within ourselves and attitudes towards other people that make for peace. And that's a challenge in our life. And I think threaded through all this is the insistence that the way we think of and respond to God is the most practical thing we do every day, in every part of our life, in every interaction we have with people. And so in everyday matters of practicality, nothing, absolutely nothing, takes precedence over God and our relationship and our fellowship with him. And so we study Proverbs because it concentrates on these challenges, and more than any other book in the Bible. I want to refer now to Proverbs 8, verses 10 and 11, where it's written, "Choose my instruction instead of silver, knowledge rather than choice gold. For wisdom is more precious than rubies, and nothing you desire can compare with her." That's why we study this book. So I want to introduce it a little bit by just talking about the authorship of this book. Proverbs, like Psalms, names multiple individuals as the authors in its various sections, but majority of it is thought to be written by Solomon. And he identified himself as the source of most of the book. And for example, in the sections in Proverbs 1, Proverbs 10, Proverbs 25, he identifies himself as the author, and it covers the majority of the book. There's short sections like in Proverbs 22 where he expresses that it's the words of the wise. And maybe this indicates that Solomon is just compiling reflections of what he's heard, teachings he's received from other people throughout his life. And then in Proverbs 24, I think we see there's evidence that Solomon drew on many sources of wisdom. He uses the plural noun for wise, or often translated the word sages, to describe the authors of that particular section, Proverbs 24. Again, it's possible that God inspired Solomon to record this section based on wise sayings he had exposed to throughout his life. And then the final two chapters, for chapter 30, chapter 31, it refers to Agar in chapter 30 and Lemuel as their authors. And, the identities of the details of who these men are remain unknown today. So again, the majority of this is though coming from Solomon. And think of the perspective he's had at sitting at the feet of King David and the responsibilities that he had throughout his kingdom and what he learned and how important it was for him to pass on this wisdom to his children. And when we say children in this particular context, it probably means everyone that he had accountability for in his not only his kingdom, but in his household as well. So I think Proverbs is so important to us as regular reading, as a source of learning, as a source of how we should live our life. While other books of the Bible speak to very profound theological truths, others have very lengthy narratives of triumph and failure. There's also a lot of prophetic teaching to a disobedient people that needs to be conveyed throughout the Bible. Proverbs gives us a compilation of very short principles for living an effective life on earth and concerns itself completely with instructing people in the path to wisdom. It's a process that he's walking us through here, right? Now, I think the authors throughout Proverbs recognized the different circumstances of a person's life and therefore are laying out principles to apply in a variety of situations rather than just a simple set of instructions to follow in only a very few specific instances. Let's get into chapter 1, and I want to read now with you Proverbs 1, verses 1 through 7. Because the purpose of Proverbs is spelled out very clearly here. Read with me here on this. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, for gaining wisdom and instruction, for understanding words of insight, for receiving instruction in prudent behavior, doing what is right and just and fair, for giving prudence to those who are simple, knowledge and discretion to the young. Let the wise listen and add to their learning, and let the discerning get guidance. For understanding proverbs and parables, the saying and riddles of the wise. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. According to verse 7, wisdom begins with fearing the Lord. But then fools, they despise it. They despise wisdom. They despise instruction. And I want to challenge us to think for a minute about what does it mean to fear the Lord? I think different things we can consider there. I don't think that means we're scared of God. I think it means that we're in awe of him, that we respect who he is and what he has created. It means living our lives considering what we know of him, what we study and learn about him throughout the writings in the Bible, what we experience in our own fellowship with him. And that's holding him in the highest value we can. I think another part of fear of the Lord is that we're willing to be dependent on him. And what that means is to humbly trust in him. And only then, Proverbs teaches us, will we discover the knowledge and the wisdom for our daily living. I want to refer now to Proverbs 9, chapter 10, or verse 10. Chapter 9, verse 10. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. I challenge you to consider for a minute then how fearing God leads to wisdom, draws us to seek that, to desire that. In Proverbs chapters 2 through 4, There's much teaching about how wisdom develops and grows within us, how it's a process that we're going through, how God is working in us and through us. The authors Tim and Kathy Keller point out here that at the start, we're confronted with a paradox, that wisdom is something we should seek. Again, in Proverbs 1, 20, 21, if we look back in chapter 1 here, it shows how out in the open, wisdom calls aloud. She raises her voice in the public square. On top of the wall, she cries out. At the city gate, she makes her speech. And yet, in chapters 2, verse 3, we're also called to cry aloud for wisdom. Let me read chapter 2, verses 1 through 7. My son, if you accept my words and store up my commands within you, turning your ear to wisdom and applying your heart to understanding. Indeed, if you call out for insight and cry aloud for understanding, and if you look for it as for silver and search for it as for hidden treasure, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. For the Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth come knowledge and understanding. He holds success in store for the upright. He is a shield to those whose walk is blameless. I want you to note the effort that we're called for in verses 3 and 4. We're called to call out, to cry out, to look for it, and to search for it as if it's a hidden treasure in our life. And I think that's our challenge here, that ultimately we should look at this wisdom as a gift. It's a gift from God, and therefore we should desire it and pursue it. I want to reference Philippians chapter 2 now, verses 12 and 13. Read with me here. Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose. I want you to see the wisdom in the contradiction itself here. If it were all up to us, we'd work our heart out to do everything perfect that we can. We would lump, and yet we'd be laboring under this crushing anxiety. We'd be experiencing constant burnout, trying to strive to be the best that God has called us to be on our own, without his power, without his wisdom, and without his forgiveness. And yet, if God only worked apart from us, we would lose all sense of initiative to be who he's called us to be, to respond to him. So the paradox gives us enough incentive and enough assurance to pursue the knowledge of God all our life long. I want to encourage you to think about this teaching here as to look at it as a continuous journey of seeking God's will and then understanding how we should act to fulfill his purpose. That's why this is valuable. That's why we should seek it. This is the treasure we should desire. This passage has been one of my go-to scriptures this year. It's something that I printed out to myself. I carry it with me along with my Bible. And as I'm going through things daily, I often want to pull that out and really focus on that. Because it challenges me to not just desire wisdom, but first to pursue wisdom. To pursue it as I should, as I'm called to. To also seek it as a treasure that I know is more valuable than the many other competing priorities that come up throughout my day and throughout my life. And yet it also challenges me to try to be patient with God, to allow him to provide circumstances that he needs me to experience, challenges that are going to strengthen me, but the diversity of circumstances in my life that allow him to use me in the way he's called me to. And to acknowledge that's on his time. It's not on my time, not on my priorities. And I find that to be a challenge. So I really encourage this passage as we go through that. Now, as we look into chapter 3 provides us a long list that can serve, I guess you could look at them as marks of the wise person. But it also are indicators of someone that's going through the process, or they're using the means for growth in wisdom. And the first one is in chapter 5. It's about trust in the Lord. And I want to concentrate on that a little bit with you. Proverbs 3, verses 5 through 8. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your path straight. And then notice how he follows that in verse 7. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and shun evil. This will bring health to your body and nourishment to your bones. There's a challenge here. Think about this. Can you believe in God, yet still trust something else for your real significance and happiness in your life? This is what we're being confronted with here. Think about it, really, and really challenge yourself to consider. When something goes wrong, let's say with your career, maybe it's your financial situation, your family. It could be a really important personal relationship in your life. Or maybe often it's a lack of personal fulfillment in the situation you find yourself in. Are you able to confront this thing, the reality that this thing is actually much more important to you than the Lord himself? Think about that. How often that is truth in our life. And then how the strong emotions we have for this thing, whatever it might be today or in this circumstance, how the strong emotions for these things in our life make us anxious, angry, impact our relationships with others, perhaps shaken if anything threatens it, your financial circumstance, your position, how you want to view yourself. Think about how it clouds your judgment, how it can distort your view of yourself and your view of the world and what's important. That our reality has become a dependence on these worldly or perhaps culturally driven measurements of success versus what we're called to here in this wisdom is a faithful dependence on a loving God who will provide all we need. Can we remind ourselves of that? Can we understand how to incorporate that into our lives in all the various circumstances we have? Can you and I trust in him? Can you and I depend on him for everything in our life? And are we willing to allow ourselves and demand of ourselves that we be content with whatever that call is from God in our life versus the many things that compete for our attention in our life? And I hope that the wisdom from this passage reinforces a reality that we don't need to justify ourselves by works, by success, by financial wealth, position, by our relationships or achievement. I want to read together now in Romans chapter 3, verses 21 to 24. But now, apart from the law of righteousness of God has been made known. Excuse me, let me start over. But now, apart from the law, the righteousness of God is made known, to which the law and the prophets testify. The righteousness is given through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. There is no difference between Jew and Gentile, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And all are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came by Jesus Christ. I encourage you to confront the many false gods that we allow to compete with our faith and to conflict with our dependence on God. And back to our passage here in verse 5. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your path straight. And notice then in verse 8, health to your body and nourishment to your bones. This is his promise in the Proverbs. Let's move into chapter 4 now, where we read an invitation which Solomon gives to his children to come and receive instruction from him. Hear this as a father speaking to his children, perhaps the way Solomon heard it from his own father. But it's chapter 4, verses 1 through 6. Listen, my sons, to a father's instruction. Pay attention and gain understanding. I give you sound learning, so do not forsake my teaching. And again, as he had learned from his own father in verse 3, for I too was a son to my father, still tender and cherished by my mother. Then he taught me, and he said to me, take hold of my words with all your heart. Keep my commands, and you will live. Get wisdom, get understanding. Do not forget my words or turn away from them. Do not forsake wisdom, and she will protect you. Love her, and she will watch over you. I think the importance here that I want to point out is instructions in God's law come from father to son in these times. Solomon recognized the importance of him being a teacher to his children, to the next generation, to his household. And it was important to him to not leave out any details when it came to the matters of these laws and how they should live their life to fulfill them. You were reminded here again to remember in detail the law of God, but also the call to live by it. Not just to know it, not just to understand it, but to live it. In their words, do not forsake it. And I think another way of putting that is we're challenged with how do we make that our way of life? This is how I'm going to live my life according to this teaching. So I encourage you to consider and to honestly ask yourself, how determined are you to get wisdom? I mean, really. How determined are you to seek that? And as we read back in chapter 2, are you honestly and sincerely calling out for insight and crying aloud for understanding and looking for it as for silver and searching for it as for hidden treasure? Because here in chapter 4, this is a repeated appeal to never, ever give up in your pursuit of wisdom. Because in chapter 4, verses 7 and 8, he instructs, the beginning of wisdom is this: get wisdom. Though it costs all you have, get understanding. Cherish her, and she will exalt you. Embrace her, and she will honor you. You see, wisdom is this principal thing. King David had communicated more than just facts of wisdom to Solomon. He wanted Solomon to love and to value and honor wisdom as a part of his life and the way he lived. You know, I think men and women often regard money or fame or romance as the principal thing. And what we're being taught here is that God's people should have a higher place to wisdom. That's the silver, that's the treasure we should pursue. And therefore we're called in this verse to cherish it. She'll promote you. The love and pursuit of wisdom is rewarded here, according to Solomon. She brings with her, I love this, she brings with her honor and ornament. I think that's how our God wants to feel about us and our intimate relationship with Him. That as we strive to seek wisdom, as we strive to implement that in our daily walk and how we live our life, that we will bring honor, that we'll be viewed by Him as an ornament in His kingdom. Not for our glory, but for His and His pleasure. I want to wrap up now just by saying, I think the way that I encourage you to look at Proverbs is not as a set of simple steps to a happy life. It's not what it is. I encourage you to read it almost like you're trying to solve a puzzle. Comprehending how it often provides, as you read through this, we'll see different views on the same issue, perhaps different solutions to the same problem. And they may even appear to conflict if you read them independently and don't read them holistically. And yet I think we're called to, as we read through and experience how the various passages or puzzle pieces work together, it hopefully provides each of us a clearer picture of some aspect of how life works for today, for this moment, that we can build on. And therefore enhances our understanding of an important principle on how to live life and how to live our life according to His will. I also want to encourage you to not read short excerpts only, yet read through chunks of Proverbs. Capture the poetry around this, the rhythm of what he's communicating often. So you can sense the conflicts. You can pick up on where they conflict perhaps. But the rhythm of a parent teaching their children about how to live as God the Father intended. So read it in chunks. So I have 3 areas of suggestions to you. Maybe you can accept these as challenges I want to pass on to you. But the first one, again, is to read a passage of Proverbs along with other scripture that you're reading, but do it daily. Take a section of this and incorporate it into your daily Bible study. Make it a routine. One of my favorite readings of the entire, or the Bible through the year was one that incorporated a daily reading of both the New Testament and a Proverbs daily. I found that really insightful. And it's a way to pick up that piece of the puzzle for the day and challenge myself to ask, how does this relate to me today? How can I challenge this? Because the next time I read that same Proverbs, it may relate to a completely different aspect or situation that I find myself challenged with. So how does this passage relate to me today? Another area I want to challenge you is to read through Proverbs 1 chapter a day for a month. Now, the months we have 31 days, it fits perfectly. Those that are 30 days, you got to read 2 chapters at the end, 30 and 31 combined. But, you know, I remember our youth group did this several summers ago, I think. They took this book and read it daily. I think they shared with one another what they were hearing and receiving on that. So that leads to my third challenge to you, and that would be to ask someone to go through a reading of Proverbs with you. We can do that with social distance, but to pick a passage to routinely read collaboratively, to talk about, think about, and pray about what that passage means to you and where you're at in your life today, and share that with one another. Encourage one another. Sharpen one another with how you view that piece of the puzzle and how it relates to your life, and perhaps how you can help them see how it relates to their lives. Because again, I think God is speaking to each of us as to where we're at today in our circumstances and how this wisdom of His Word in Proverbs relates to that. Now, for next week, I want to encourage you to be reading Proverbs chapters 6 through 10, and David Taylor will lead us through that. So read ahead and be prepared to think about how to be encouraged and sharpened as we go through those chapters next week. Again, thank you for allowing me to share a little bit about an introduction on this book, but also some passages that I find very challenging, but also valuable for me as I try to be who God calls me to be. Thank you. Look forward to seeing you soon. Farewell.